On the morning of April 18, 1943, Captain Thomas Lindbergh sat in the cockpit of his Lockheed P-38 Lightning at Fighter II airstrip on Guadalcanal, studying a mission map that showed a round-trip distance of nearly 1,000 miles over open ocean and enemy-held jungle. According to every fuel calculation in the official P-38 flight manual, that distance was not a difficult challenge or a problem to be solved. It was a hard physical impossibility. The twin Allison engines simply burned fuel too quickly to cover that distance and still make it home. The mission in front of him was anything but routine. It was the authorized assassination of Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet and the strategic architect behind the attack on Pearl Harbor. American codebreakers had decoded Japanese naval communications and discovered the Admiral's inspection itinerary with extraordinary precision. According to the intercepted message, Yamamoto's transport aircraft would cross the skies above Bougainville Island at exactly 9:35 a.m. If American fighters could reach that point at that moment, the most influential naval strategist in Japan would disappear from the war in the span of a few seconds of gunfire. The importance of the target was obvious. Yamamoto was not simply a senior officer who could be replaced. He was the operational mind behind Japan's naval strategy since 1941, respected even by the American commanders determined to kill him. Removing him meant removing the one man whose strategic vision had shaped every major Japanese naval operation of the war. But intelligence success did not solve the problem of physics. The range of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, even with external drop tanks, fell short of the required distance when calculated using the fuel consumption figures specified in the official operating procedures. Those figures existed for a reason. The Allison engines were designed to run on a relatively rich fuel mixture, more fuel compared to air, because that mixture kept combustion temperatures low enough to prevent damage inside the cylinders. Running the engine leaner meant less fuel relative to air. That improved fuel economy but raised temperatures dramatically. The engineers who wrote the manual had seen what happened when temperatures climbed too high. Burn valves, seized pistons, and sudden engine failure. Over the Pacific Ocean, engine failure meant something simple and final. The aircraft became a falling object with no runway in sight and no rescue likely to arrive in time. So the official procedures favored safety. They traded range for reliability. They assumed that the margin between normal operation and catastrophic failure should never be reduced to something pilots had to gamble with during combat. Into this problem stepped Charles Lindbergh. When he arrived among the combat squadrons of the Pacific, he did so as a civilian technical representative, not as a uniformed officer. He had no rank that required pilots to obey him. To many of them, he was simply the famous aviator who had flown the Spirit of St. Louis across the Atlantic 16 years earlier. And now, he was suggesting something that sounded dangerously close to heresy. He argued that the official mixture settings in the flight manual were unnecessarily conservative. According to him, the pilots of the P-38 had been leaving hundreds of miles of potential range in use because the engineers who wrote the manual had designed their procedures around maximum safety rather than maximum efficiency. In other words, Lindbergh believed the pilots could fly farther than the book said, if they were willing to run their engines leaner, hotter, and closer to the edge than the engineers had ever intended. At 0600 on the morning of April 18, 1943, Captain Thomas Lindbergh sat in the cockpit of his P-38 Lightning at Fighter II airstrip on Guadalcanal, staring at a mission map that showed a round-trip distance of 1,000 miles over open ocean and enemy-held jungle, a number that every fuel calculation in the official P-38 flight manual said was not a challenge to be managed or an obstacle to be worked around, but a hard physical impossibility that ended the conversation before it started, because the twin Allison engines of the Lightning burned fuel at a rate the official operating procedures were designed to manage within a range envelope that fell far short of what the mission required, and no amount of optimism or combat urgency could change the mathematics of how much aviation fuel fit in the aircraft's tanks. The mission in front of him was not a routine intercept or a standard combat air patrol, but the authorized assassination of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, the man who had planned Pearl Harbor and whose personal inspection tour itinerary had been decoded from Japanese naval communications with enough precision to know that his transport aircraft would cross a specific point in the sky above the jungle of Bougainville Island at exactly 0935, and that if the intercept flight could reach that point at that exact moment, the most important military mind in the Japanese Empire would be removed from the war in the space of a gun run measured in seconds. The strategic weight of what was being asked was not lost on anyone who had looked at the briefing materials, because Yamamoto was not simply a high-ranking officer whose removal would require replacement, but an irreplaceable strategic architect of the Japanese naval war effort, the man whose operational vision had shaped every major Japanese naval action since December 7, 1941, and whose tactical sophistication was acknowledged even by the American commanders trying to kill him as something his subordinates could not replicate regardless of their own considerable abilities. The decoded intelligence that had made the mission possible had come through a chain of signals work representing some of the most valuable cryptographic successes of the entire Pacific War, and the window it opened was narrow, because Yamamoto was a man of precise habits who kept to his schedules with the regularity of someone who believed discipline was its own form of armor, and the schedule the Americans had decoded would put him over Bougainville on April 18th, whether the intercept flight could reach him or not. The problem that planners of the 13th Air Force had been staring at for 48 hours was not tactical but arithmetic, and arithmetic does not respond to urgency, authorization, or the strategic importance of the target. The published combat range of the P-38 Lightning, operating under the mixture settings and throttle procedures specified in the official flight manual, was insufficient for a 1,000-mile round trip by several hundred miles, and the external drop tanks the aircraft could carry added range, but still did not close the gap completely when the fuel consumption figures from the official procedures were applied to the mission distance. The engineers at Allison who had written those fuel consumption figures had not been careless or conservative without reason, because they had watched what happened to P-38 engines when pilots pushed the mixture settings outside approved parameters, and what happened was not subtle or gradual, but immediate and catastrophic. The kind of engine failure that turned a functioning aircraft into a falling object over water, where no rescue was possible and no runway was within reach. The mixture setting specified in the manual was rich, meaning more fuel relative to air than the engine strictly needed for combustion, and that richness served a specific purpose, keeping combustion temperatures inside the cylinder heads below the threshold where aluminum components began to fail, valves began to burn, and pistons began to seize against the cylinder walls in ways that ended an engine's functional life in minutes. A lean mixture meant less fuel relative to air, which meant hotter combustion, higher cylinder head temperatures, and a much smaller margin between normal operation and catastrophic failure, a margin engineers had decided was not acceptable given the consequences of engine failure over open ocean. And the official manual reflected that decision with the authority of documents written by people who had seen the alternative and rejected it. Into this arithmetic problem walked Charles Lindbergh, and the reception he received from combat pilots in the Pacific Theater was exactly what any middle-aged civilian technical representative could expect when arriving among men who had been flying P-38s in combat for months and proposing to teach them something about their own aircraft that their experience seemed to contradict. Lindbergh was not in uniform. He carried no rank obligating anyone to listen to him, and his most famous aviation achievement was already many years in the past. Yet he was proposing to tell combat pilots that the official mixture settings they had been trained to follow for survival were unnecessarily conservative, and that they had been leaving hundreds of miles of range unused every time they flew because the engineers who wrote the manual had been solving the wrong problem. The pilots looked at the civilian with his slide rule and his careful explanations and made the same assessment that men doing a dangerous job for a long time often make about advice from people who have not. They listened politely and changed nothing. The mockery was not cruel, but it was consistent, expressed in a particular way military aviation culture responds to civilian expertise, a patient surface-level engagement that concealed a deeper dismissal based on a reasonable assumption that a man who was not flying combat missions in the aircraft under discussion had limited standing to tell the men who were what the aircraft could safely do. Lindbergh was proposing that by reducing manifold pressure to around 22 inches, dropping RPM well below the standard cruise setting, and leaning the fuel mixture to a ratio Allison engineers had specifically warned might be damaging, pilots could extend the P-38's combat range by 500 miles or more without harming the engines. The pilots who heard this proposal compare it with their own experience of what happened when P-38 engines were pushed hard and concluded that Lindbergh's confidence in the technique was not supported by anything they had personally witnessed. What the pilots could not know, because they had never tried the exact combination of adjustments Lindbergh described in the exact sequence he recommended, was that the engine damage Allison had documented occurred when pilots leaned the mixture while maintaining high power settings, high throttle, and high RPM at the same time, combining the worst effects of hot combustion with the mechanical stress of maximum output in a way that destroyed engines quickly and reliably. Lindbergh was not proposing lean mixture at high power, but lean mixture at reduced power, a combination that actually produced lower overall temperatures than the rich mixture used at standard cruise power, because the reduction in power output more than compensated for the increase in combustion heat from the leaner burn, leaving the engine running cooler, more efficiently, and dramatically farther on the same quantity of fuel. The official manual had documented the danger of one combination, and written rules that prevented the other, an institutional overcorrection that looked like caution from the inside and like a 500-mile range penalty from the outside. Lanner looked again at the mission map and the fuel calculations and understood with the clarity that comes from staring at an impossible number long enough that the only path from Fighter 2 to the sky above Bougainville and back ran through the technique the civilian with the slide rule was proposing, and that the choice in front of him was not between a safe option and a risky one, but between a risky option and the certainty of watching the most important mission of the Pacific Air War slip away because the manual said the engines might not like it. The demonstration that changed everything did not happen in a briefing tent or classroom or any place where military institutions normally process new ideas through slow layers of approval and authorization. It happened in the air at altitude with instruments running and skeptical eyes watching from nearby cockpits. Lindbergh understood that the only evidence capable of changing the minds of combat pilots who had already decided he was wrong would be the kind that appeared directly on a fuel gauge and an engine temperature dial at the same time and refused to be argued with. He had spent enough time in rooms where expertise met skepticism to know that a slide rule and chalkboard would not close the gap between what pilots believed about their engines and what he knew about them. And the only thing capable of closing that gap was a demonstration flight that allowed experienced pilots to evaluate the technique with their own instruments and their own eyes. Lindbergh first flew with the pilots of the 475th Fighter Group, using the same patient and methodical fuel management approach that had carried him across the Atlantic in 1927, and that he refined ever since. Manifold pressure reduced to the low 20s, RPM lowered well below standard cruise settings, the mixture leaned beyond the limits listed in the manual, and the aircraft trimmed for level cruise at an altitude where the Allison engines could breathe efficiently without being forced. To work hard, the pilots flying alongside him watched their instruments with the focused attention of men expecting to see something go wrong and ready to record exactly how it happened. But what they saw instead was an engine temperature gauge that was not climbing toward the red line, but running cooler than the temperatures they were used to seeing at standard cruise settings. The first crack in the certainty that had made the earlier briefing discussions so unproductive. The fuel gauges told the second half of the story, and that second half turned skeptics into converts with the efficiency only large, undeniable numbers can produce, because the fuel consumption rate produced by Lindbergh's technique was not slightly better than the official settings, but dramatically better, a difference that showed up clearly on the gauges in a way that could not be dismissed as instrument error, wishful thinking, or confirmation bias. Where the standard settings burned fuel at a rate that placed the practical combat range of the P-38 several hundred miles short of Bougainville, the lean mixture technique at reduced power burned fuel slowly enough to close that gap and push the aircraft's practical range beyond the mission requirement with enough margin to turn the return flight into a calculation rather than a gamble. The pilots who flew those demonstration missions returned to Fighter 2 with full engine logs, intact cylinder heads, and the quiet expression of men who had just discovered that something they had been absolutely certain was true was not true at all, which is one of the more uncomfortable experiences available to people who are very good at their jobs. The technique itself was not complicated once the pilots understood why it worked, and Lindbergh was patient enough to explain the reason as carefully as the procedure, because he knew that pilots who understood why something worked would apply it correctly under pressure in ways that pilots who had simply memorized steps would not. The Allison engine, like any internal combustion engine, produced heat from the act of burning fuel, and the relationship between mixture ratio and combustion temperature was not linear. A lean mixture burned hotter than a rich mixture at the same power setting, which was a fact the official manual had correctly identified and built its restrictions around. But the power setting was not held constant when Lindbergh leaned the mixture, and that was the part the manual had missed. By reducing manifold pressure and RPM at the same time as the mixture adjustment, the total heat produced by the combustion process was actually lower even though the burn itself was more efficient. In the same way that a small fire burning dry wood produces less total heat than a large fire burning wet wood, even if the smaller fire burns hotter per piece of wood, the official manual had looked at the temperature of the flame and written rules about it without properly accounting for the size of the fire. The practical example Lindbergh used to make this understandable to pilots who were not engineers was the image of driving a car on a long trip. The official P-38 operating procedure was like driving at highway speed with the engine working hard the entire time, which got you there faster and kept the engine comfortably within its limits, but burned to the fuel tank at a rate that limited how far you could travel on a single fill. The lean mixture technique was like setting the cruise control at a moderate speed and letting the engine settle into an easy and efficient rhythm that covered the same distance using far less fuel without asking the engine to do anything it was not designed to handle. The pilots who heard this explanation and who had just watched their own instruments confirm it during the demonstration flights absorbed the way useful information is absorbed by people whose survival depends on it, completely and immediately and without the resistance that had characterized every earlier discussion of the technique. The spread of the method to the P-38 squadrons on Guadalcanal in the days between the demonstration flights and April 18th moved with the speed that information travels among people whose lives depend on its accuracy. It moved fast, and it moved completely, pilot to pilot across the flight line in the specific currency of trusted operational knowledge that carries more weight than any briefing or manual because it comes from someone who sat in the aircraft, watched the gauges, and returned alive. Squadron commanders who have been the most openly skeptical of the civilian with the slide rule were among the first to adopt the technique once the demonstration flights had placed the evidence directly in front of them, because military aviation commanders are ultimately practical people whose loyalty to any doctrine ends exactly where a better one appears with instrument logs to support it. With the range problem solved, mission planners could finally focus on the other element that mattered just as much as fuel efficiency: timing. The intercept required a level of precision that separated a perfectly executed ambush from a near miss measured in seconds within the unforgiving mathematics of aerial interception. 18 P-38s had to arrive over a precise point in the sky above Bougainville at exactly the moment a Japanese transport aircraft would cross that point on its way to an inspection tour whose schedule had been decoded from signals the Japanese believed were unbreakable. The intercept route was plotted to keep the formation below Japanese radar coverage for most of the transit, flying roughly 50 feet above the ocean surface on a heading that avoided the known positions of Japanese Coast Watcher stations, maintaining strict radio silence for the entire outbound leg and approaching the ambush point from a direction that gave the attacking element the maximum possible time to complete their gun runs before the escorting Zero fighters could intervene. Effectively, 18 P-38 Lightnings were selected for the mission from the 339 Fighter Squadron, their external drop tanks filled capacity, their ammunition loaded, and their pilots carefully briefed on the lean mixture technique with the emphasis on precise execution that the mission's fuel requirements made absolutely non-negotiable. A pilot who reverted to the standard mixture settings on the outbound leg because the procedure felt unfamiliar or the engine temperature made him nervous would arrive at the ambush point without enough fuel to complete the return trip. And the Pacific Ocean was not a forgiving environment for aircraft that ran out of fuel over enemy-held water. The target was confirmed by intelligence updates arriving to the evening of April 17th. Yamamoto's transport had departed Rabaul on schedule. The inspection tour was proceeding exactly as planned, and the decoded itinerary remained accurate, which meant that the aircraft carrying the commander-in-chief of the Japanese combined fleet would be exactly where the intercept plan predicted it would be at precisely the moment the American fighters arrived. The engines of Fighter II were already warmed and running in the pre-dawn darkness of April 18th, and somewhere above Rabaul, a Japanese Mitsubishi G4M transport was climbing toward cruise altitude carrying a man who kept a schedule with the regularity of someone who had never imagined that his schedule itself might become the thing that killed him. Between those two facts stretched 1,000 miles of ocean and jungle, and the fuel-saving technique that a 51-year-old civilian had fought an entire room of combat pilots to teach them, a technique that had now become the only reason the mission existed at all. At 0725 on the morning of April 18, 1943, 18p, 38 Lightnings lifted off from Fighter II airstrip on Guadalcanal in the exact order mission planners had determined would give the formation the best chance of reaching the ambush point with precise timing the intercept geometry demanded. The moment their wheels left the coral runway, each pilot began applying the lean mixture technique that the success of the mission depended on, reducing manifold pressure and RPM at the same time as the mixture adjustment in the exact sequence Lindbergh had demonstrated, and that the demonstration flight logs had confirmed produced a fuel consumption rate that made the 1,000-mile round trip mathematically possible rather than mathematically fatal. The formation dropped immediately to wave top height as it crossed the coastline and headed northwest over the open waters of the Solomon Sea. The aircraft flying at approximately 50 feet above the surface, low enough that the propeller wash disturbed the water below them, low enough to stay beneath the coverage of Japanese radar installations on the islands to the north and west, and low enough that the pilots had essentially no margin for the kind of distraction or inattention that normal cruising altitude permitted. Minute 1 through minute 10 of the transit were the hardest in the specific way that the beginning of any long and dangerous operation is always the hardest, because the mind has not yet settled into the narrow, focused attention that sustained low-level flight eventually produces, and instead continues running through every variable the mission briefing had introduced. The fuel calculations, the timing requirements, the weather conditions over Bougainville, the estimated strength of the zero, escort, and the fundamental question that no amount of planning could answer in advance, which was whether the decoded schedule was accurate enough that the 18P-38s would actually find Yamamoto's transport at the specified point in the specified time, or whether they would arrive at an empty patch of sky above the Bougainville jungle and turn back with 1,000 miles of ocean behind them, and nothing to show for it except proof that Lindbergh's fuel-saving technique worked. The pilots kept their eyes on the instruments and their hands steady on the controls, applying the lean mixture settings with a careful and deliberate attention of men who understood that mistake in fuel management at this stage of the flight would not reveal itself until return leg, at which point there would be nothing left to do about it. Minute 10 through minute 30 belonged entirely to the ocean, which from 50 feet of altitude at 200 miles per hour was not the wide navigable expanse that map suggested, but a flat and featureless surface rushing past at a speed that left no time for the eye to find reference points and no margin for the gentle course corrections that navigation at altitude allowed. Pilots who had flown this kind of low-level ocean transit before knew that the psychological challenge of it was different from, and in some ways more demanding than the tactical challenge of an air-to-air engagement. Because in a dogfight the threat was visible and the response immediate. But in low-level ocean flight, the threat was the water itself, and the response required was sustained concentration that produced no drama and no adrenaline, yet had to be maintained for the better part of an hour above a surface that offered no visual cues and no reassurance. The fuel gauges were moving at exactly the rate Lindbergh's calculations had predicted. The engine temperature gauges were holding at levels the official manual would once have flagged as concerning, but that the demonstration flights had already proven acceptable, and the formation remained on course and on time in the quiet, precise way that well-planned operations tend to unfold when every element of preparation has been executed correctly. Minute 31 brought the coastline of Bougainville into view, the green mass of the island rising ahead of the formation as the pilots began their climb from wave-top height to the intercept altitude the geometry of the ambush required. The timing check performed by the flight leader at that moment confirmed what the fuel consumption and elapsed time had already suggested, which was that the formation would arrive at the ambush point almost exactly at the moment the decoded intelligence predicted, a level of navigational precision achieved after more than 400 miles of featureless ocean without landmarks or radio navigation, representing the kind of operational planning and disciplined airmanship that often made the difference between a mission that succeeded and a mission that arrived 2 minutes late to an empty sky. During the climb, the pilots armed their weapons, the 4.50 caliber machine guns and the single 20mm Hispano cannon mounted in the nose of each P, 38 coming to readiness in the sequence the pre-flight briefing had specified. The formation divided into the kill element and the cover element required by the attack plan. For aircraft remaining low to intercept the transports, while 14 climbed to engage the expected zero escort and keep it away from the attacking fighters during the few critical seconds when the gun runs would leave the kill element exposed. Minute 32 was the moment the mission stopped being a navigation exercise and became a combat operation, because 32 minutes after crossing the Bougainville coastline, the lookouts in the formation acquired the visual contact the entire operation had been built around. Two Mitsubishi G4M Betty, transport aircraft emerging from beneath the cloud layer at low altitude, flying directly toward the point in the sky where 18 American fighters had arrived with the quiet precision of a trap closing exactly as designed, right on the schedule that a Japanese admiral who kept his appointments with the regularity of a man who had never imagined a schedule could be used against him had maintained to the minute. Escorted by 6 fighters flying top cover at an altitude that placed them above the transports but below the American cover element that was already maneuvering into position. The visual contact was the moment every element of preparation shifted from theory into reality. The decoded intelligence had been accurate. The timing had been correct. The fuel technique had delivered the formation to the exact point in the sky with engines running and weapons armed. And the man aboard the lead transport had roughly 90 seconds left before the outcome of the mission made his schedule permanently irrelevant. Minute 33 was a gun run. The engagement itself lasted seconds rather than minutes because of the enormous disparity between what a Lockheed P-38 Lightning carried in its nose and what an unarmored transport like the Mitsubishi G4M, the Betty, was designed to survive. For .50 caliber machine guns and a 20 millimeters cannon firing from a single concentrated point gave the Lightning a devastating forward punch, and the kill element used it exactly as planned. Thomas G. Lindbergh, Jr. came in from above and to the right. Rex T. Barber approached from below and behind. The geometry forced escorting fighters to split their attention, leaving the transport briefly exposed. At under 1,000 feet, Barber's guns found the target. The converging streams of .50 caliber rounds and cannon fire tore through the fuselage and fuel tanks of the lead Betty. The aircraft carrying Isoroku Yamamoto rolled, trailing smoke and flame, and plunged into the jungle of Bougainville Island. The crash site would later become one of the most examined patches of ground in the Pacific War as investigators reconstructed the final moments of the commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Minute 34 brought the end of the second transport. The trailing Betty was hit during the attack and crashed into the sea off the island's coast. Its crew and passengers did not survive. The 6 escorting fighters, Mitsubishi A6M0, reacted immediately, realized what had just happened. They pursued the American fighters with the urgency of pilots who understood the scale of the loss unfolding in front of them. But the plan had anticipated exactly that response. The 14 aircraft of the cover element, whose presence had only been possible because of the extended-range fuel technique taught by Charles Lindbergh, engaged the pursuing Zeros and brought the kill element the seconds it needed to break away. What followed was a brief, chaotic engagement above the Bougainville coastline. Turning fights, sudden climbs, flashes of gunfire, and a constant effort of every pilot to track enemies, allies, altitude, and fuel all at once. Then the American formation turned south. Minute 35 through minute 60 belonged to the long return flight over open ocean, and this was where Lindbergh's technique proved itself beyond argument. The engines continued running smoothly at the lean mixture settings he had demonstrated. Cylinder temperatures remained within acceptable limits, and the fuel remaining in the tanks was enough to make the 1,000-mile round trip possible. One aircraft did not return. Raymond K. Hine was lost during the engagement with his escorting fighters, the single American casualty of the operation. The remaining pilots turned toward Guadalcanal, carrying the strange, emotional weight familiar to combat aviators, the knowledge that the mission had succeeded and that someone had not come back. 16 Lightnings eventually rolled to a stop at Fighter II airstrip. Their fuel gauges showed something that the official performance tables said should not exist: remaining fuel after a 1,000-mile combat mission. Their engines were intact despite operating at mixture settings the official manuals had warned against, and the gun camera film pilot reports, and intercepted communications confirmed that the commander-in-chief of the Japanese fleet had been killed. The operation, known to history as Operation Vengeance, had succeeded through a combination of cryptography, navigation, precise timing, and a fuel management technique that many pilots had initially dismissed as impossible. But when the aircraft shut down on the Coral Strip that afternoon, the evidence required no interpretation. The numbers on the gauges and the absence of Yamamoto from the Japanese order of battle were proof enough. The ground crews who walked out to meet the returning aircraft ran their hands along the engine cowlings away mechanics do when they are searching for the physical evidence of stress, heat, and damage. What they found on the 16 set of Allison engines that had just completed the longest combat mission in the history of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning was not the cracked cylinder heads, burn valves, and seized pistons the engineers had predicted, but metal that was warm, intact, and mechanically sound in ways that were going to require a serious reconsideration of what the Allison engine could actually tolerate in operational conditions. Confirmation that Isoroku Yamamoto had been aboard the transport destroyed over Bougainville Island moved through intelligence channels faster than the formal after-action reports. When the news reached senior commanders in the Pacific Theater, it carried a particular weight of information that changes the strategic situation in ways that take time to fully understand. Yamamoto had never been a replaceable figure in the command structure of the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had been the central strategic mind behind the fleet's operational planning since before the attack on Pearl Harbor. His death created a leadership gap that his successors would struggle to fill for the remainder of the war, and the difference gradually became visible in the quality and coherence of later Japanese naval strategy. The American commanders who authorized the mission understood immediately that they had changed the course of the Pacific War. They also understood something else at the same moment. The mission had only been possible because a civilian with a slide rule had been right about something the engineers believed was impossible, and he had been stubborn enough to prove it in the air instead of accepting the institutional verdict delivered inside briefing tents. The engine logs from the mission were forwarded to Allison and to the Army Air Force's engineering authorities. They arrived not as ordinary reports, but as documents that demanded explanation, because they described operating conditions the official manual had prohibited while producing results that contradicted the manual's predictions. The response from the engineering community was not an apology and not a public acknowledgement that Charles Lindbergh had been correct. Instead, the official manuals were quietly revised. New mixture and power-setting guidance appeared in technical updates written in the neutral language of institutional procedure, the kind of language that removes a memory of the argument that produced a change and makes the revision appear to be the natural evolution of policy rather than the acceptance of inconvenient evidence. Once validated by a mission as consequential as the Yamamoto interception, the technique spread rapidly through the Pacific squadrons flying the P-38. The operational effect was immediate. Mission planners began calculating range using the new fuel consumption figures rather than the conservative limits printed in earlier manuals. Targets that had previously been considered beyond practical reach were reconsidered under the new numbers. The operational radius of American fighters expanded across the Pacific in ways that the earlier calculations had concealed. Japanese defensive planning had assumed that American aircraft could not operate effectively beyond certain distances from their bases. When that assumption proved wrong, gaps began to appear in the defensive perimeter. Those gaps accumulated slowly but decisively through the remainder of the war, because air superiority often grows in exactly that quiet way. One side discovering it can go where the other side assumed it could not. After his time in the Pacific, Lindbergh returned to the civilian life that had always been his primary identity. The role he played in the Yamamoto mission remained largely in the background, carried with a quiet understanding that official histories would focus on the pilots who flew the intercept and the intelligence teams who broke the Japanese codes. This was not an injustice, so much as the way institutions record events. They remember the visible actions more easily than the enabling conditions that made those actions possible. Lindbergh had not gone to the Pacific to attach himself to a famous mission. He had gone as a technical representative who understood aircraft engines well enough to recognize that the official operating procedures for the P-38 were leaving capability unused, capability the pilots needed and the war demanded. The broader legacy of what he demonstrated extended far beyond that single mission. The insight that conservative safety limits established under one set of operating conditions do not necessarily apply under different conditions became part of the broader engineering understanding of long-range fuel management. That understanding influenced how aircraft were flown and how long-distance missions were planned during the remainder of the war and later in the commercial aviation industry that expanded rapidly after 1945. Meanwhile, the wreckage of Yamamoto's transport slowly rusted in the jungle of Bougainville. The 18 pilots who lifted off from Fighter II airstrip on April 18, 1943 flew the mission because the intelligence was good, the authorization came from the highest level of command, and combat pilots fly the missions they are assigned. One of those pilots, Raymond K. Hine, did not return. The 17 who did came back in aircraft with intact engines, sufficient fuel, and the knowledge that the operating procedure engineers believed would destroy those engines had instead carried them 1,000 miles across the Pacific and back. None of that happens without the lean mixture technique. And the lean mixture technique does not reach those pilots without the 51-year-old civilian who crossed the Atlantic alone in 1927 and then spent the spring of 1943 patiently arguing with combat pilots until he was allowed to show them something true about their own engines. We remember this story so that the role of Charles Lindbergh in the mission known as Operation Vengeance never disappears into silence.